welcome back, guys. Thanks again for your time here for another conversation. And these conversations are really meant and targeted for helping church leaders and helping people who help church leaders. Because the local church is what the way we see and understand Scripture. The local church is God's method for getting this movement that Jesus started, continuing to spread and expand that around the world. And so we're talking about last time we had really what is the first part of this conversation. So we talked about specifically spiritual growth pathway and how that has become, it's always been a part of the conversation, but here in the last couple of years, for a lot of church leaders, it's really risen in kind of priority and urgency of we need to clarify our spiritual growth or disciple making pathway. Of course, we love that and celebrate that because we think that's absolutely true and critical. But in that conversation, that last one, we ended up talking about calling and how helping people in churches, individuals in churches, understand their calling and what God's called them to do and be specifically is an important piece of an effective disciple making pathway. So kind of continuing the conversation from there, I guess I know for me, you hear a lot of different words used around this idea of calling. And I think many of us who have been in kind of church leadership world for a long time, there are a lot of different ways that people talk about calling and everything from, it's finding your passion or discovering your purpose or how, even terms like a personal mission or your personal vision, right? I've heard all of these kinds of things, but it all kind of gets pretty confusing, to be honest, of how we're using all of those different terms. So I'd love to start this time just by saying to both of you, how do we think about all of these different kinds of terms that really don't seem to or we use them to mean the same thing? How are they different? How do we navigate that?
Yeah, I'm really glad you're bringing this up, Steve,
hmm
because I think the lack of definition in the vocabulary and using words like passion, purpose, calling, mission, vision to all mean the same thing. Actually, it's more than just a battle for language. It's a battle for productivity, fruitfulness, and faithfulness. And just having done a lot of this work for a significant amount of time, you can really see where people kind of get stuck because they are using all of this simultaneously, and maybe they've had a breakthrough in one place, but their lack of productivity or fruitfulness is coming because they don't see the connection to the next place of it. And so I think one of the things that we've just been working a lot on is really defining this language well, but also connecting it to one another, to each part of it, so that both individuals and churches can live more fruitful in who God has made them to be.
Yeah, that's really good. Well, let's start with I think I know I've heard just in you guys talking about this, there really seem to be five words that come up over and over: passion, purpose, calling, mission, and vision.
Yes.
So how do you see those? Do those fit together? Do we need to use all of them? Or
Yeah.
I'm also a writer words guy. So could we
Yeah.
just use one? Or how do they all
Yeah,
do
no,
we need them and how do they fit?
yeah, I think they do play together really well. And again, this has been like even before we started slowing down to clarify this, we were doing a lot of work in this space. But in this last kind of reinvention, we really slowed down here because we felt like it was incredibly significant. And the image that I would like to put in everyone's head is they function almost like a Russian doll. So they're nested inside of each other.
Got it.
And part of, when we talk about disciple making culture and creating a pathway in a church, without one nesting inside of the other, you end up getting pretty hollow pretty quick. So you might have a church mission, but you're not igniting calling, or you might have something that you call a calling that really is more of a purpose. And so slowing down just to see the way that these all fit inside of one another, I just will say for me has been really helpful to intentionalize what was kind of intuitive, but not necessarily said very well.
Got it. Got it. So what if we're thinking of the Russian dolls,
Yeah.
let's start with the smallest one. So what's kind of the first one, that core one that's in the middle?
Yeah, so I think we want to start with the word passion. And I want to differentiate that from excitement. Again, even with that word, people talk I'm passionate about what they're excited about. And the difference between excitement and passion is pain. So when we talk about passion, passion is a conviction that becomes contagious because it withstands the test of pain.
Mm,
This is the stuff in our life that we're willing to go through pain for. The difference between excitement and passion, when pain comes to excitement, excitement diminishes. But when pain comes to passion, passion deepens. So, really, that test of pain is what differentiates passion from excitement. I think we live in a world today, and want Shane to come in here and just kind of add some color commentary on this. We live in a world today where we've confused passion and excitement, and we've tried to just stack things we get excited about on top of one another rather than really dive deep into the things that we are passionate about.
Yeah, it is interesting. And we hear it all the time, especially among young people, like find what, and that's the messaging, obviously, even in culture that's often given is just find out what you're passionate about, like live into that. And
And you'll never work a day in your life,
yeah, you'll never
right?
work a day like right. We have all this language around that, which is helpful in one degree that passion is important. And yet at the same time, passion by itself does not lead to the clarity of purpose.
Mhm.
And we often connect that then too, Dave, with abilities. It's like your passion and your abilities have to they really connect together in a way that if you know your passion, right? But you don't know your abilities, the strengths that you have, and really what you have to bring to the table in essence, you will find yourself pretty frustrated in that. And the verse can be true too, right? If you know your abilities, and yet you don't know what you're passionate about, you'll find yourself just incredibly bored in many
Right.
ways, along the
Yeah.
way.
Yeah.
And that, that
Well,
that brings us to that second word, Steve, where we move from passion to purpose. Purpose could be defined as your motivated or energized ability. So purpose is the overlap of what you're passionate about and what you have ability for.
mhm.
So what Shane's referring to there is if I know my passion, but I don't know my ability, I really haven't discovered my purpose. I've just simply listed my passions. Same thing is if I know what I'm good at, what my abilities are, but I haven't really taken some time to look at life experiences to say, what were even some of the pain points that my passion is coming from, then you're going to be bored because you can do it, but you don't have great motivation for it. So if you think about purpose as motivated or energized ability, it is the overlap of where your passions and abilities meet and come together. So that first, like kind of Russian doll is passion
Mhm.
inside, that is inside of purpose, but it has to be included with ability for it to really get to the questions of purpose. And the questions of purpose are really around the questions of why. Why do I do what I do?
Mhm.
And purpose, we would suggest, is something that uh, doesn't change much over time. It can
Mm.
deepen, but it's not going to necessarily change. You can understand it and articulate it better over time. But purpose, which is that passion and ability, is something that's going to be pretty static in regard to that it's not changing. You're not moving from one purpose to the next.
And I think too, just to tap on the why there, why do I do what I do? And even too, why am I burdened for the things I'm burdened for? As you think about, one of the things we actually love to do, Steve, is help, people go back into their story, and things as well, and just really mine out, like, what is it what makes you want to, pound your fist on the table, in essence, like what's that why as well. And that, again, as Dave's saying, like, the combination of those two things brings a lot of clarity to someone about, really what their purpose really is.
Yeah, it's interesting because of that motivated ability, like you were saying, Dave, when the purpose and the ability come together, or the passion, sorry, and the ability come together, that's what is purpose. And even going back to like that quote of like, once you find your passion, you'll never work a day in your life. But I've actually found it's the opposite. Once you find
Yeah.
what you're really passionate about, you'll
Yeah.
work harder at that, and
Yeah.
you'll be willing to put blood, sweat, and tears into it. Like there's a sense that I think, like you're saying, in the messaging that we use, we mislead people a little bit, meaning like that it won't then take effort, or it won't be something that there are times where you're like, why do I, like, I just need to, like, it would be actually, my life would be easier if I could let this go. But like you're saying, it's a passion. It's something I pound on the table.
Yeah, I mean, it's not about the amount of work, it's about the result of the work. Like, it's about the productivity of the work. And so there are certain things that when I put my effort to, I see exponential gain in. So when we talk about your abilities, we're not saying you might just, be good, go from 0 to 100 on that. You can grow your capacity for that ability, your competency in that ability. So there's places to grow. It's going to take effort, but we're going to help you identify, what are those things when I give that effort to, I see exponential results for. So again, start with passion. Passion plus ability equals purpose, but purpose in and of itself is not all that there is to calling. So we go to that next language piece, which is calling. Here's the way we're going to define calling. Calling is the intersection where the depth of your purpose meets the scope of your influence. We say that again. Calling is the intersection where the depth of your purpose meets the scope, or in other words, you can put there the width of your influence. And this has been really, I mean, just in our last journey, Shane, this has been really clarifying, because over and over again, our experience would be, does calling change or does calling not change?
Right.
And that was always kind of the big argument. And what we're able to differentiate here is, well, your purpose doesn't change, but your influence does. And so when we think about influence, influence is the people and the places that your purpose is best lived out with. So influence is going to change. You can work to widen your influence, so to speak. And when you think about calling, the way this really manifests is, for the first part of my life, that the influence was really around students and teenagers, and like, but as I've gotten older, that influence has changed a little bit. It's widened a bit. And so has my calling changed? Well, my purpose hasn't changed, but the scope of my influence has changed. So in that sense, my calling has grown and evolved and changed. But what's kind of comforting is it's been the same purpose all along the way.
Got it. I think that's where, yeah, those Russian dolls help
Yeah.
to think about that. Sorry, what were you going to say, Shane?
Well, just say that it is, think about that too. I mean, all of us can look back in our lives. I think what Dave's talking about there as well is the different life stages, different situations that are going on. That, again, your influence is changing, because if you think about, again, people in place, that's what we talk a lot about there is people in place. Those people and places shift over times. And from a maybe just a gospel centered, nature on this too. I think even as we think about, young people in this world, there is this sense of, the more we focus on understanding who has God designed us to be and leaning into who he's designed us to be, that goes back to that passion and ability, and let him, let the Lord really worry about the breadth of it. So we lean into the depth of it, and the more we understand that, it oftentimes opens the door more and more, and we let the Lord focus on the breadth of it. What ends up happening a lot of times, think about it, we get in reverse. I want to work on the, everything is about, more followers, more scope, more influence and things. And yet I don't know really, who am I, and who has God designed me to be. And the more I know that, that influence continues to then often expand.
Yeah.
Yeah, because that's what people resonate with, right? Is
Yeah.
when you're clear
Yeah.
about who you are, and that's what grows and allows you to have that influence. And speaking of that's fantastic. It's really good.
That then brings us to that fourth word, which is mission.
Got it.
And mission is the place that our callings come together.
Mm.
It's the sense of, you know, I always tell people if you can do what you're called to do on your own, you've either overestimated yourself or misheard God. Because my calling is important, but my calling plays a role in the bigger mission that God has for his church. And so, one of the ways we can talk about this is Jesus always sees individuals, but he sends teams. He sees individuals. He calls, like in his ministry with Peter, he says, "You're no longer Simon, you're Peter." He's calling out of Peter, who Peter doesn't even really know who he is. And so he sees that, and there's a sense of calling that is associated with that. But that calling is lived out in something bigger than his individual fulfillment. And that is the mission of the community of believers that God is doing his work in the world through. So, mission,
And that's even
yeah,
the rest of that statement, right? You're now Peter, and
right,
on this rock,
right,
right?
yeah,
Like
yeah, yeah, exactly.
it's that the calling and
Like that.
mission, like right
Right.
next to each other.
Right.
Yeah.
So I want you to see this for a couple of reasons, because here's two mistakes I think when it comes to calling and purpose in our lives and mission in our lives. The first one is we start to think calling is just for me.
Mm.
Calling is not just for me. It's my part to play in the bigger mission that God is fulfilling in his world.
Mm.
And that requires me being attached to other people. But the second is just the reverse. If you're a church leader, if you want to accomplish the mission that God has placed for your church, and all you are igniting in people is where are they good? What is their ability? You're
Mm.
short-circuiting the process. It may help you fill your volunteer drain pipe, but it's not going to help you create your leadership pipeline, because mission should activate calling, uh, which is then, defined by purpose plus its influence. And when we just short circuit that to, hey, here's the mission of our church, what are you good at? We don't ignite the intrinsic motivation of the Spirit of God working in a person's life. We are just simply, we kind of deteriorate into filling spots into what we need to happen. And again, I don't think anyone does that intentionally. We're just trying to mobilize the mission of our church. But I think just even this framework is really helpful to say your mission is going to be best energized when you're igniting calling, which then goes further into purpose, which is, that passion and
Right.
ability. Then all of a sudden you're working from intrinsic, not extrinsic motivation. I don't have to
Yeah.
motivate you to do it. Now it's inside of you. I've called that out of you. And now you motivate yourself to play your role in our church's mission.
Something you're naming there, Dave, I think is really good too. I've not really thought of before, but as a church leader, when I'm simply trying to awake in gifting and clarity of
Right.
gifting
Right.
or in people so that we can utilize that in the ministries of the church, I'm actually inviting people into my influence,
Right.
live their calling into my place of influence, my scope, my influence, versus actually expanding the larger mission of the church into helping them identify how does that play out into their scope of their influence in their relational spheres as well. And again, this just gets back to that, people's 9 to 5 matters.
Yes.
Right. And part of living out your calling, we often would say too, is being able to live it out in all of the areas of your life, and
Right.
really connecting the dots to people's vocation as well, and how they bring the kingdom, in essence,
Right.
into those spheres of influence. And so now the mission of the church really does continue to
Right.
expand.
Which is what we talk about, Shane, in our bigger process at Clarity House Funnel Fusion. When we define mission, it's what we all do together, and it's the all play everyday mission that we're on. So that is what mission is. Calling is my role to play, and how I play that every day in the places where I live, work, and play. So you can see the way this all goes together, and the
Yeah.
way it gets short circuited, which then Steve has dramatic input for our disciple making cultures and what it is that we're creating. Last piece here, because I know we're jamming a lot here in a little bit, is
It's a
vision.
lot. Yeah, it's
And
good.
vision is about where is God taking us next. It's what's the impact that we hope to see in the future. So as we live the mission out, to what end are we hoping this will come to? Where is God taking us next? What's the specific, pain problem, people group that we, as a church, are living this mission out that we hope to see impacted, and that is the vision proper. Passion functions inside of purpose, but purpose is passion and ability in the overlap. Purpose functions inside of calling. It's purpose plus your influence is what calling
Mhm.
is.
Yeah.
One is pretty, static. The other is changing all the time. Calling functions inside the mission of the church, and the mission leads the church to imagine its impact, which is vision. And, just being able to articulate that clearly and recognize why we don't often see the results we want to see is that somewhere along the way, we've tried to short circuit that process exactly the way that Shane was talking about. We try and ignite people's gifting and get them on mission. And that's why I'm so excited about Handcrafted Calling, because it actually helps a church intentionally make all of those connections. And we've done, like I said, in the past, we've done a lot of calling work. I don't think we've been nearly as intentional as this new resource is, this new training process is, in putting those things together to better help the church in its disciple making pathway. And that's why I'm so excited about this new resource. It's designed with church leaders, with them in mind. It's about the activation of the church through personal calling to help the church live out its mission. And it's the most intentional we've ever been in really connecting the dots of all the things that we've talked about there.
Yeah, and so I love that you're connecting that to so this is why we've created this thing called
Yeah.
handcrafted calling, because again, kind of circling back to the first conversation we had a couple of weeks ago about um disciple making pathway, right? And so everybody is now thinking more than ever about how am I creating that clear disciple making pathway that helps people identify here's where I am in the process, what my next step is, how I can be a part of the mission. And yeah, I think the kind of that light bulb moment of we too often in our in our attempt to grow the influence of the church and grow the ministries of the church, we're actually expecting people to leapfrog, to short circuit a few
Right.
of those steps.
Right.
And that's why you're struggling to get those volunteers, and that's why, because we've skipped a few pieces there.
Yeah. And
Um,
at best, what we saw over and over again is that in the best disciple making cultures, if they weren't igniting calling and doing some training associated with that and descending, you're going to have a culture of spiritual formation, which is important. It's really important.
mhm,
But you're not going to have a culture of spiritual reproduction.
got
And
it.
that's the big difference, not just disciples, but disciples who make disciples who make disciples. And, igniting calling and doing some training for the sending is really what differentiates spiritual reproduction from spiritual formation. Spiritual formation is my ongoing personal development as a disciple of Jesus. But when I really start thinking about my impact on the world, I've got to move beyond spiritual formation to spiritual reproduction, what we talk about as the multiplication funnel of a church. And, sadly, too many times, disciple making pathways don't include any of that.
Right, yeah, because unfortunately, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but my perception is that what we've meant by spiritual formation has turned into Bible study,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
And go ahead,
Go ahead.
Shane.
Well, I was
No,
just going to
just
say, I
go.
think you're right because I think maybe if there's a defining terms, we talked about mission, we would call that general calling.
Got it.
As for all believers. So a lot of times what we're focused on is most of the ministries of the church are focused on helping people understand their general calling of loving God supremely, loving others sacrificially, and maybe making disciples or serving the world on that. That's general calling. And so most of what ends up happening in that spiritual formation is helping people identify that aspect, but not bring that over into their everyday life and live out really their special calling and uniting those two things together, which I think then leads to a lot of times, which we know just a lot of people they feel the disconnect between their faith, they're loving God and loving people, and I can serve in some ministries and things at the church. And then how does that play out on Tuesday? How does that play out in my family? How does that play out in my neighborhood? How does that play out in my workplace? Like the rest of life. And clarifying calling really does help bring the two of those together so that faith lived out, the general calling lived out in the unique ways that God has designed me to be, gets played out into the everyday places of life.
And just practical, I know we got to wrap up, Steve. Literally this morning, I'm helping our Grace residents, and they're coming to the end of this handcrafted journey that I led them in, and they're talking about their personal calling, but it's fulfillment in light of their church's mission.
Yeah.
And the way they're talking now about their church's mission and then what that looks like in the everyday places where they live, work, and play, it was just absolutely stunning and beautiful. Every person who came out of this process had a deeper appreciation for their church's mission. And they were so glad that they got to be, it wasn't something they had to be part of, they got to be part of this church. And now they know how they play a vital role in that. And so, literally, this morning I was watching it, and it's just watching all these pieces come together when you watch someone really clearly define their purpose. We could talk about that in a future session with 2 words. We moved
Yeah.
to their handcrafted calling, and naming that in under 12 words, and then that's attached to the mission of their church, and then they get a chance to figure out, how do they express this where they live, work, and play. Watching that all come together and the movement that was created in people's hearts, one of the most beautiful things that I think we get to see. And I love, being firsthand in a room where that is happening.
Yeah. Yep. Absolutely. Just, I think one last question from me with all of this, and as kind of the continuing discussion, we're going to have, as you're referencing, Dave, there's a whole lot more that we have to talk about. We can get a whole lot more detailed in this. We do want to direct people to the handcrafted calling resource that we've created and are going to be releasing really widely here in the next few weeks and months. But what are some like immediate next steps that even I would say beyond handcrafted calling, how would you encourage pastors, church leaders to bring these concepts of the kind of those nested pieces of passion, purpose, calling, mission, vision
Yeah.
um, into what they're doing on a week to week basis? What are some practical ways or practical questions that they can ask themselves or their staff to kind of help them identify where the gaps are in their current pathway?
Yeah, I mean, I think even before you get to a church, you just individually, this
Yeah.
is work to do. I mean, I can't tell you. I mean, sometimes as pastors and leaders, I'll say we are the worst at this because we get so attached to a role that we're playing that
Mm.
we think our calling is that role. And then we can't give that role up because we don't know who we are anymore if we don't have that role. And so I think, first of all, just recognizing our tendency as pastors and leaders and our staff's tendency to find their identity simply in the current role that they are playing. And so I think first of all, it's us saying, hey, is there some work that we can do together
Mm.
on this that will give all of us better clarity and better understanding of our own identity outside of our role? And then, let's move from there to thinking about the
Yeah.
pathway at our church and what it might look like to ignite people in this. And just, I will just kind of just one word of caution. When you start igniting this, it is contagious. Like, and so
Right.
the pathway isn't just about igniting calling. It's, are we
Right.
ready as a church when people start wanting to step into their calling? Do we know how to support them? Are we ready to support
Right.
them in that? And honestly, what we find is most churches aren't, like, they haven't even had an imagination for what
Right.
might need to be created in their pathway to support everyday missionaries who are living out their calling. And so
Right.
when you get to the calling piece, it's like, okay, let's start imagining, if we were igniting this, what would we need to create to help people be able to live this out with better fruitfulness?
I would just even say in that too, Steve, to what you were asking on that as well,
Yeah.
as it gets ignited, I think that actually increases the imagination. So it's hard to do it ahead of time.
Mhm.
It's hard to
Yeah.
imagine ahead of time, right?
Mhm.
But actually, I say as you're wanting to move forward as a church, I don't know a church that doesn't want to, like, hey, we want to expand the gospel influence, in this
Yes.
city, community, region, or whatever it is, and things. As you start activating this, your people in many ways will start helping you to see what are
Yes.
those places that we've never even thought of. What are the things that are needed in our pathway? Because in essence, they're now asking for them rather than you trying to go, hey, this is good for you, you need to be in this, or you'll benefit from X. They're actually telling you. And it's the old, if you listen to the field will tell you what
Yeah.
what
What
it
it
needs.
needs. Yeah.
And if you listen to your people, like you start awakening this in people, it'll actually help you understand more of. We're watching that with churches that we're working with who are piloting first, not trying to take everyone, everyone who have a sermon series on this, but piloting first and just being helping, concentric circles in essence of people begin to awaken this. It's helping them see what awaken really imagination for what do we need to train on? What do we need to make available? What connections are there already that we need to be convening people on that have a similar sense of calling around?
Yeah. Well, I want to take just a moment. If do you guys have a few minutes to continue for a couple minutes? This could even be
Yeah,
like a little bonus addendum
sure.
that we can
Yeah,
add. But I think, Shane, what you just said there about piloting
yeah,
things
yeah,
before we take it wide to the entire
yeah,
congregation is, in a lot of ways, it's so antithetical to what
yeah,
many church leaders are used to doing. Like,
yeah,
wow, we have this thing, everyone needs to know about it now, and
yeah,
everyone needs to do it now.
yeah,
How do you balance that with this idea of, we're going to do a pilot, which is, I mean, which is uh, a Jesus model,
yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah, totally.
Which is, we're starting with a smaller group, and we're going to ignite this in them, and then that's going to expand. And frankly, the business world has done this for years, right?
Yes, totally.
When they're wanting to innovate and do something new, they pilot it first. So can you just talk a little bit about, Shane, maybe
Yeah,
how we've seen that work in
yeah,
churches and to
yeah.
be effective and create some of this momentum?
Yeah. Let's connect back to that Jesus thing for a minute, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So even the way I think Dave and I always talk about this, not just looking at the words of Jesus, but the ways of Jesus. And again, not just, the 3, the 12, that's one way to think about that. Like you were just describing a little bit,
Yep.
like there's another thing of just, I think even thinking about the way that we hear the Great Commission versus how they heard the Great Commission then.
Yes.
Because it was just that thing, the way he casted vision was, hey, that thing that we've been doing together over the last 3.5 years? I want you to go do that in the same way. So that's a little bit about piloting too, right? He's lived
Yeah.
it with a few, pulled a few close, lived it with a few, and then the vision casting wasn't to the masses right away. It was, go live this, and this will repeat. So I think in the same way, there is I'll use our dear friend Derek up in Erie, Pennsylvania, right? Started with just taking 20 people. It might be taking 10 people in a certain context. It might be taking 5 people and just saying, hey, let's grow this underground first. Let's experience it first. See what happens. It's the most non-disruptive way to begin leading change. And I would just say it that way, right? When you try to
Yeah.
take it to the masses, you won't be able to keep up. You're going to awaken too much imagination at one time, create too much a gap before you can deliver. And then
Yeah.
actually it'll demotivate people from that. So again, using Derek as just a case study, they've introduced it. It helped them as a team with a group of 20 hand-selected people. They just kind of pulled together. They didn't announce it anywhere. It helped them now discover out of that group, not only how did it go and how do we walk into this, but what is it our people are going to need? And now they're doing their second kind of tier of people they're starting to pull in, but they're already ahead a bit on, okay, we know what they're going to need when they come out of this, and we can begin activating that. And that over time is, just principles of leading change, right?
Yes.
You're in essence building it, you're piloting, you're building a little guiding coalition, and then you're letting the stories begin to emerge from that, which now we've got like proof of concept in essence, and we can start bringing more and more people into that water.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If not, if you try to get everyone once, you can inspire people toward it, but you have to train people into it. And
Yeah.
you can't train like the individual attention that is required to stop and slow down with someone and to be able to train them into it. It just doesn't work in the right space, even of, public space, over 70 people, you're gonna be inspiring people, but you're not going to be able to really train them into it. And so this process is a training process. It's not a small group process where we're just trying to get people connected. It's not a process that is just about some sermons to preach. It's not, teaching. It is
Not just
training.
awareness on calling, right?
Yeah.
Like we're not trying to make
Yeah.
people aware of the idea of calling.
It is
Right.
actually the tools to train someone and to help them do that work of these kind of Russian dolls. Find your purpose. All right, now let's talk about your calling. Now let's talk about the way that helps fulfill the mission of our local church. And we walk people through every step of that.
Yeah.
Yeah, the difference between Steve Dave talks about it a lot, really, I think really well, like says it really well, is as we're getting into the multiplication funnel, that it's not about how many people we're trying to get through it. And that's kind of sometimes the mindset that we have as pastors and leaders, sometimes because we're excited, like for all good reason, like we're excited about something.
Totally.
And so it's not about how many people are trying to get through something, but it's actually how many people actually get breakthrough. And you just can't do that at, hundreds at a time in that. And we just were talking with a pastor the other day who said, we preached it first. This is not handcrafted calling, but this idea of calling, we preached it first and awakened a ton of interest. And then it fizzled out in literally like weeks. He said, as we started shifting to training and then the coaching, and that's what Dave's naming after this too, is like, it's the one-to-one little bit of coaching that go, how do we help you now implement this in those next steps, is where the real impact begins to come.
Yeah, that's really good. Well, I appreciate you guys indulging me on that. That's something I just know in my experience, and even as you guys are talking about it, I'm thinking about it in different ways of, I think there are so many reasons why churches and church leaders want to go to like immediately create a sermon series and immediately send it to everybody, is because first of all, that's what they've been trained to do. Literally, that's what we've been trained to do, is to stand up and preach from the pulpit on Sunday morning. That's the role. That's what we're doing.
Yeah.
Like we've been trained, this is the whole teaching center to training center, right? We've been trained to teach. But it's even interesting to me, and I've never had this thought before, even in whatever you think of the state of school and education in America, we talk about like a better school has a better teacher to student ratio, right?
Yeah.
You don't say, hey, we're going to teach everybody, and all the kids that are in the first grade, or even all the kids from first through fifth grade, we're going to teach everyone together in a big group. And that's what we're going to do. Like you guys are even like smirking, like that would be ludicrous. We would all say, that's crazy. Why are you doing that? But that's what so many churches do every Sunday is we're taking people at every point that they are in their spiritual development and say, we're going to train everybody, or we're going to teach everybody at the same time. And that there's just a huge difference between what you can do in that large group and then what you can do in those small groups. So, such good stuff, and I think so helpful. Any kind of closing thoughts on this? I think we've hit a lot, and but yet there's more. There's more to come.
Yeah. Just to encourage you to go back and really slow down and hear what we're saying in the language. Don't assume because you heard it once that you
Yeah.
get it. Like hear it a couple times, and not because we're some great people or anything like that. It's just been really helpful for us to slow down and clarify those things.
Yeah.
So just take some time to do that.
Sweet. Awesome. Thanks, guys. Appreciate conversation as always.